Tanya Brothen. I'm the Deputy Cultural Affairs Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. And I also want to thank the American Academy for partnering with us. Marie Christine and John, thank you so much for working with us on this event. And it's my pleasure to welcome so many students. I think we all notice a lot of young faces here. We have over 10 schools represented here tonight, students and teachers. So thank you so much for coming out to see us.
Thank you. Thank you to the English Theater and to the U.S. Embassy and, of course, to the American Academy for having Thomas here. The update is that Thomas now lives in, well, he lives in Paris, and he's currently at the American Academy. You've done such a great job of introducing him that I don't really have that much more to add. I read Thomas's memoir, Losing My Cool. He tells us about growing up of mixed race. His mother's white, his father's black, in middle-class New Jersey, and how he grapples with his identity and trying to find an authentic identity, and he found it, from what I read, through hip-hop culture, and it never quite fit. It was something that he could never really find himself in, and eventually it's a coming-of-age tale, and as he goes off to university and then travels the world and goes to France, he discovers that hip-hop doesn't exactly fit to an identity, or his identity. It's one identity, but one that didn't work for him. And what happens to young people as they become more educated and they travel the world and they meet different people, they find that identity is not such an easy thing to pinpoint. And that's what I really loved about your memoir, because I think we've all been through that, particularly those of us who've chosen to live in a different culture. And I deal with similar issues in my memoir. But tonight we want to talk about your upcoming work. And again, you deal with identity, and this time because you have a daughter who doesn't necessarily look like you. So your wife is white, and your daughter took on all those recessive traits and is blonde, yeah, and has blue eyes. And so that's fascinating, and I'm very excited to talk to you about that, because I also have mixed race children, but we have probably very different experiences, mm-hmm, because my kids are very obviously my kids.
which does make it...
Which makes a difference, absolutely. Yeah. But my eldest was born very, very white. He looked white, and no one thought he was mine. So we can talk about that later. So Thomas is going to read, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight on a Monday night, a cold Monday night in Berlin. I'm going to read a bit from my essay, Black and Blue and Blonde, which was published in 2015, a couple of years after my daughter was born, and it's the seed of the book project that I'm working on now at the American Academy.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick that apart a little bit. And you say my parents were never less than adamant on the point that both my older brother and I are black.
Yeah.
And in your memoir, you very clearly chose to be black, or what you thought was black. You chose one aspect of being black, or one identity of being black. Why? What?
I think it's because I'm American. I really, after living for 6-7 years in Europe, Americans have a peculiar way of dealing with race, and they have a kind of skin obsession, and they have a plantation logic that comes out of having slavery. And I think the fear of losing status by being black, that makes whiteness a very prized possession. And so I think that we were black because we were disqualified from being white. And that didn't start with us. It started centuries ago, and it became a custom, and then it became a thing of pride. And then a black community turned this kind of strange thing where you have people who look everything from white to charcoal black, all saying that they're black and all accepting each other and all recognizing each other when they pass on the street, and it became something quite nice, and then it became for me never a burden, but like something that I liked a lot, you know. And then the older that I've gotten, I've only now, as a father, started to question some of the philosophical and pseudoscientific premises upon which my whole identity has been based, you know. And it's something that I'm certainly too old to question and revise, but I'm trying to consciously remove myself from this game that we play in the States, where we act as though there are pure racial categories, and that being mixed is a mixture of two pure categories when everybody is in fact
everybody's mixed. Exactly. Yeah. The white people are also mixed, and
the black people are definitely mixed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But what about your mom? Because your mom doesn't come up so much in the memoir. You talk a lot about your father. He clearly had a huge influence on you. What about your white mom? Did you feel that you had to make some kind of a choice when you decided to? You're like, I'm going to be this hip hop sort of cliche.
Well, no, I don't think I was making a choice. I really don't think that you can choose to be white if you don't really look white. You can be like lots of other things, but you can't make. It's not really your choice, because your identity is partially what's inside of your own head, and it's partially what society and other people reflect back at you in their gaze and in the way they interact with you. And so that choice is only available to some people who are really on the margins, you know. But it wasn't mine.
Some try, though. We know some black people who try to maybe please or try to appease to a certain white community. But
my parents, I just didn't feel blackness wasn't really something that I felt of as being stigmatized. I liked it a lot. Like the coolest athletes were black. I was really into sports and basketball especially, so there was a lot of pride in that. Like most of the entertainers and musicians we were living to. You get this kind of, my first book is really about this kind of almost intoxicating pride that you can get in the coolness that's associated with blackness. It's also somewhat associated with a sense of being bad that you realize when you get a bit older, and if you care about being smart, you realize that there's a kind of condescending flip side to that too, because you're cool, but you're not supposed to actually be. You have access to coolness, but you're not supposed to be like getting the best grades in class, or you're not. There's an anti-intellectualism that's assumed as well. Yeah. It cuts both ways. But I really liked the cool aspect, and I was seduced by that. The reason why I don't write as much in my first book about my mother is because I really didn't know that this first book, Losing My Cool, I started to write when I was in grad school. I was 26, and I had published one article in the Washington Post, and I got a book deal, and I was writing a book, and I didn't know how to write women. So it's like no deeper than that. Like it can be quite difficult to like. I really understood how to inhabit my father's psyche, but I didn't at that time have as much confidence writing across gender.
Okay. Yeah.
I hope I'm getting better by this book.
Well, interestingly, now your daughter is going to look more like your mother than you.
That's true. That is true. It started already.
I've never seen your mother, but just because you say she looks,
they're colored the same.
Yeah. What do you think that'll be like for your daughter?
I think a lot about this. On the one hand, I think a lot of the way that my father and I, and a lot of people right now, and certainly adults, are obsessed with race. I think it's kind of wonderful if she doesn't have some of our obsessions, because it's liberating. I think all the time of like Richard Wright, a black American author who was one of the expatriates in the 20th century in Paris. And he said that, people asked him, why aren't you back home fighting for freedom? And he said, every hour you fight for freedom is an hour that you're not free. And sometimes I do think that you need to fight, but sometimes I think every day my daughter doesn't think about race is like a day that she's free from some of the neuroses that we have. On the other hand, I feel like you have certain ancestral debts. And so I am kind of in all of these white rooms that she's growing up in and that she feels very comfortable in. I don't know what she will think of herself, and I wonder how much she will remember certain people that are not in these rooms. that are not like reflected back to her in people's expressions when they meet her on the street. And I don't know, you know, and that's something I'm really wondering about. And I'm also wondering, what does debt to your ancestors really mean? You know, I don't know, and I'm trying to think it through in a very serious manner.
Well, the idea of having, owing a debt to your ancestors, do you think that maybe it's more prevalent in communities that have been oppressed?
It is. I mean, it's certainly, I have Jewish friends who think very seriously about this. You know, I'm sure there are many other types of communities that do too. It's less prevalent, I think, like, I don't think as many French Parisians like my wife think about a debt to any of their ancestors. Right. Certainly not. But I think it has to do with being aware that certain people that produced you never got a chance to thrive or flourish, and that if you or if your children get a chance to thrive or flourish, that they don't be glib about it, or they don't, that they don't become frivolous or something like that. Don't become too light. Yeah, I think there's like a kind of gravity that you think you owe, and you want them to have a good life, but you don't want them to become frivolous.
And you also don't want them to have a huge chip on their shoulder. I know with my children, I had they were lucky enough to be quite young when Obama was inaugurated. We had, they were, I think, like 4 and 5. We had a big pizza party. They were allowed to stay up and watch TV. And there was a very deliberate sense of, I want them to first have a sense of pride and that being black can be something, something so amazing before they learn the rest. Before they learn the other side, I show them Eyes on the Prize, or show them, we just watched Selma.
And before they learn about a narrative of oppression that will be forever attached to them.
Forever, yeah. Right. So, and then that's where this idea of having a debt, even if you live a certain type of privilege. I mean, let's face it, your daughter will, as you said in the text, she won't experience what maybe a black-looking girl will, or a black-looking boy will. Well,
already they're just interactions where I never really thought very much about eye color before she was born, or just like the huge premium that like everybody puts on blue eyes, not just white people, but like black people. In Brooklyn, walking my daughter down the street, older black woman comes up and says, "My, what big, beautiful blue eyes you have," and that really like strikes me. It's just, we all buy into ideas that certain physical traits, which are literally skin deep or even shallower, mean so much about who you actually are. Right. And like I think about how early on that starts that reinforcement that like she's aware that she has blue eyes, and she's aware, like she has a white cousin who doesn't have blue eyes, and like actually like between the two of them, like you get more attention having blue eyes.
Having blue eyes,
yeah,
Right.
But among whites, and so it's I mean, she has another cousin who's mixed, my brother's child, who's got skin like mine but blonde hair and blue eyes, and so her mother is Russian, and Russian can kind of ask why her skin is dark. They don't notice the blonde hair and the blue eyes; they notice the skin is dark, and they think, "What happened here?" On the street. So it's amazing that these things are in the eye of the beholder as well. Race is local.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask what it's like in Paris, because in Paris there's, just for the nature of the history, a lot more mixture. You see a lot of children of mixed race. How is your family perceived when, let's say, you're walking down the street, the three of you?
Paris is interesting because I think maybe I don't know nearly as much about Germany as I do about France, but the French are not obsessed with skin color. They have their own kind of thing. In my experience, the French care a lot about origins. They care about your religion or lack thereof. They care about where you're from, but they can they don't exactly understand why I'm black either. They don't really care, but they also like, I think the first thing that jumps out to them is that I'm American. Like my national origin means more than like the pigment in my skin. And so living in Paris is interesting as a black person. I think this is why it was so liberating to a lot of 20th century black expats, is because first and foremost, you're not black, you're American, and it might be the first time that some black people, I think, last century certainly felt American is when they left.
When they left,
it's
yeah.
liberating. You live outside of, for a moment when you're there, you live outside of the American racial binary, and you can even sometimes forget about some things that you become aware of as soon as you're back in the States,
So for you, does that change as well? I mean, you say you don't like to use the term biracial or multiracial. I guess in Paris you can identify as being an American, but if people
I would also say I'm
depressed-
black because I think what I'm trying to do, and it's very difficult, is I'm trying to actually get past the language of reifying like color categories by saying I'm black. But I believe what I mean when I say I'm black is I believe like it's an ethnicity, it's like a cultural tradition. But like I don't like to use biracial or multiracial because that presumes that some people are monoracial, which I really think is part of, and I don't think that like me alone stepping out of that language game makes a difference, but I think that I have to also try not to participate in it because I think ultimately it's like a prisoner's dilemma where no one steps out of it because other people are still in it, but we all more and more realize that scientifically these things, these abstract categories that we sort ourselves into don't actually exist.
Right. There, it's an interesting point because people somehow feel ownership to their race, like I own dreadlocks, or I own, I own this. Certain things cannot be taken or appropriated by others. It's a big discussion right now. Can white people have dreadlocks without, being offensive to?
Why not?
Yeah, it is a discussion. I find it very interesting because I have one of my closest friends from college is of Dutch Jewish descent, and her husband is half black and half Jewish, and they have 2 children, and one of their children is very, very, very white, very pale, with red hair. And, but he has a pretty wide nose, thick lips that he has from his black, who knows where it's from. And
these things pop up.
They pop up all over the place. And he decided around the age of 10 that he was just gonna, wear the baggy jeans. He was going to, everything is about hip hop, and he grew his afro out really big, and at one point the black kids in his school started teasing him, and they said, "Why are you trying to appropriate black culture? And who do you think you are?" And it was crushing to him because he's like, "I am black," and they were laughing. They're like, "What do you mean you're black? You've got red hair." And this, it's fascinating because my family comes from the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, there's every single kind of mix you can imagine. I mean, the Caribbean is a very, very mixed society, racially. So it's not
dozens of terms for different, it's not just
terms.
black or white, dozens of biracial.
Exactly. So it's not uncommon in one family to have someone much darker than I am, and someone with blue eyes and curly hair, but it's blonde, and everything in between. But this idea of appropriation, I mean, will this change, do you think, the more mixed a society will become?
I don't know. I'm kind of down on appropriation right now because it seems like it's intensifying rather than loosening
It's intensifying.
up. I think maybe the more mixing that happens, the more intensified it might get because people become more insecure about their identities. I don't think, 200 years ago people were obsessed with identity because they just were French, or they just were what they were from their tribe, or they just were. And I think the more that you're encountering others, the more you're guarding, you're locking down, your own. As an ex, I think this. As an ex, I know this. You don't know this. This is my truth.
Yeah.
This is my hairstyle. But some of the most formative cultural touchstones for me are German philosophers or French novelists. So I think, is that not some form of appropriation? I wouldn't give them up, and I wouldn't even say that they belong to the Germans or the French alone. They belong to me because I'm a human being and I have eyes and have a brain, thankfully, and I can read, and this stuff speaks to me. Dostoevsky speaks to me as much as, I think, as much as speaks to some Russians, even though I can't read Russian, you know, so.
Well, I mean, to sort of maybe be a devil's advocate, is it wrong to have a very strong identity? Is it wrong to strongly identify with something? I mean, this was brought up at the American Academy a couple of months ago. Is there clearly there's a point, a dangerous point, when
I think
there's too much identification with any one particular race or nation, or but on the other hand, you know, when you have children, people tell you, oh, they have to know where they come from. They have to know who.
Yeah, I think
that
they are. Identity is a good thing in moderation. I think that you don't want a world where everybody is generic and no one has an identity, but also identity is a sword that cuts both ways, and identity politics and identitarianism is a game that can be played by people whose identities you don't approve of, as well as by people whose identities you do approve of. So you can have white nationalists in America or in Germany and France who have a kind of not a very generous conception of identity, but the more that we have this identity brinksmanship, where I'm a trans Latina woman and you're a, you know, Afro-Caribbean woman, period, and then at some point, you know, I don't see how you create that world, and people, some white nationalists, some alt-right extremists, far-right extremists don't pick up that sword too and say, well, why does everyone else get an identity but me, and why do I have to be ashamed of my identity? I think it's only a necessary part of that. So I think probably what we want to do is find commonalities while being rooted in inheritances, but not obsessing over inheritances.
Right.
You know, but then it's tough because some people suffer more for their identities than other people
Than
do.
others, exactly.
So it's a delicate kind of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you have been sort of, you've reviewed both books of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and people have thanked you and also criticized you for taking the stances that you've taken, basically challenging the sort of nihilistic view of what it means to be black in the United States. I mean, it is in many ways a very grim picture, obviously, if you look at some statistics and how black men are still treated in the United States, and how can we still talk about these really horrible truths while not fetishizing about race, or without focusing on the racial aspect of true injustices? I mean, it's...
Yeah, I mean, there's real injustice in the world, and it affects certain communities disproportionately, but I also just think that, like, there's no single narrative, and I think that as bad as things can be, I don't really think of being black as one uninterrupted misery. And I think that oftentimes in the way we talk about race, it's like, oh God, like, to be black, you know, like, you fall outside of Western beauty standards, and then, like, you're also probably being harassed all the time. And I just think that actually, like, even at very bad times, you know, like, there is always this black tradition of joy and the blues and jazz and this kind of black discipline and philosophy. And, you know, like, you're a slave and you're picking cotton and you start singing, and it becomes the music that defines America. It becomes rock and roll eventually, and it mutates. I mean, there's always this, I just don't see it as being so grim. Even when it's grim, there's a beauty in having a life that's connected to feeling. So it's always, there's a tradition of black writers that Coates falls outside of or gives short shrift to. And then I think there's just not a uniform black experience anymore. I think that oftentimes what we're talking about when we're talking about blackness is we're talking about impoverished blackness, which is a real thing, which is a very serious thing. But there is a kind of black experience that defies stereotypes and cliches, and that is also probably at times subject to skin prejudice and different things, but that is not exactly, I don't recognize my life in some of what Coates writes. And there is a mixed black experience that I'm not the only one, you know. Sure. Like, there's a lot of black people that have, like, Jewish family, and they have German family, and they have there are black kids like your children. That's an actual black experience.
Right.
So I think that when the single narrative takes over, it actually does a disservice to some of the anti-racism and the noble ideas that you and goals you're fighting for.
And I guess, going back to your text, you say, to my knowledge, I've never been followed in a store. People don't cross the street when I approach, and the sole instance I've ever been pulled over in a car, I was absolutely speeding. And that's great. I mean, that's great that you haven't had those experiences. But there are many, black men who have.
Your brother has.
Your brother, right? You're right about it. Your brother, certainly my father, my brother, were harassed just based on the color of their skin. Is it just the luck of the draw that that we can discuss race in the way that we discuss it based on what we've experienced?
I think it's complicated. I mean, there are ways that there are cultural signifiers that are. I think that basically in my situation is just as my situation, but there's certainly skin color privilege or lack thereof. And so there's colorism, and I've benefited probably by not being profiled because I don't fit certain suspects' description.
Right.
But the black experience is a multicolored experience. I think there's also, I write in my first book that there was a huge change in the way that I was treated by professors and by, the way I was looked at by police and things when I changed the way that I dressed when I was about 19 years old. So is that fair? No, that's not fair. But there are ways of moving through the world that signal certain things. And I think that oftentimes we live in a very classist society, and I think that oftentimes race trumps class in our discussion, but I'm not sure that in the lived reality, I'm also, now I'm an adult and I have a certain level of education, I don't often read about like the instances of excessive police force. I don't often read about people who are educated the way that I am either in those situations, but that's not really, that becomes a level of complication to the conversation that oftentimes people don't want to have, because there is a very real racial component that we should be very sensitive towards, but it is a flattening of some of the story.
How do you think we should be talking differently about race?
I think there simply need to be more voices involved in the conversation. I think that there's like over 40 million black people, so that's like, you're getting up to the size of a lot of Western European nations. That's like Spain or something, it's a lot of people. It's as diverse an experience as the Spanish experience, So why is it that we, at any given time, there's like 3 or 4 voices that you can think of on the subject, At times there's probably less than that. It's good. We live in a very good time right now, and in many ways I'm optimistic. There's more people essaying the black experience, there's more people novelizing it, there's more people dramatizing it than there ever have been before, and more people seem to be listening and reading. We're in Germany, we're talking to a room, I can't see anything actually, but I don't see an enormous amount, I don't remember an enormous amount of black faces, but people are interested in the subject, at least I hope, it seems that way. So I'm optimistic about it, and I think the way to get to the bottom of these things is to talk more and to experience more.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a great point to maybe open up the discussion.
Maybe that's a good. Oh, I think it fits very well, but I think that it's in the public imagination maybe. Yeah.
So I think we have to change that image of people a little.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think in a German context?
In the German context or in American context?
In American.
In American context.
In American context. Oh.
I mean, we actually, there's actually a long history of black intellectuals. And one thing that's unfortunate is that you don't really learn about it in American public schools. I don't think. You have to go to study.
You think so that's the idea of role models that are missing?
Well, No, I think that oftentimes poverty is what we're really talking about, and I think that many Americans don't. Also, segregation in America is still an enormous social reality. A lot of white Americans are the most racially segregated people in America, and they don't really meet tremendous diversity. They don't have diverse encounters with black people often. And so then their understanding of what it means to be black is often conditioned by what it means to be black and poor. And so then there's not the these expectations that, that people meet you and they say, you're not, you're different than, So I think that some of what you're talking about would be solved with an eradication of poverty, which seems very unlikely with the current political climate. But I also think that some of what you're talking about would be greatly helped by a more integrated civil society, which also doesn't seem like it's on the list of priorities right now with the political leadership. But it does also happen on a community level. People make conscious decisions of how segregated their lives are, And so if we can have a public conversation about like what we're trying to have tonight, and if that can gain more traction and if more people talk that way, and I think that that can be all to the good. But ultimately, I mean, these things will be fixed when people decide that it's untenable to live otherwise, or that it's no longer morally satisfactory to live otherwise. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Especially when, if you're younger and you're in a fight or you're in a dispute and somebody, wants to, that's a common insult you can encounter because it's a kind of claim that you're inauthentic. But in terms of, the black community is pretty used to seeing all kinds of colors and hair textures and things like that. So most people genuinely accept that being mixed is being black if you claim blackness. I think when people start to evict you from the black community is when you want to dissociate yourself from them. I think that then it becomes a different conversation, and the rejection goes both ways.
And they pull your card
and
get your black card removed.
Well, it's the interplay of the two, I really think. So, I thought Barack Obama always had a good answer to this. He said, people said you grew up in Hawaii and you were raised by white people. Why did you say that why do you mark on the census that you're African American? And he said, because, when I walk down the street, if no one knows where I'm from, that's the way that people interact with me. So I think that you can't escape the way that you're read. But I also think you do have a fair amount of self-definition, especially on the margins, because there is no line at which you can say somebody becomes white instead of becoming something else. It's very vague, and it's partially who you're descended from and who you choose to recognize and how you're recognized. So it's this weird interchange and exchange, and I think that if society learns to talk about these things in a different way, we will see that identity isn't fixed and doesn't have to be constructed the way that it happens to be constructed today. The way that things are today are not the way that they were 500-600 years ago necessarily, and I hope that these are not the ways that identity will be fixed forever, permanently. That's a great question. A part of that was in this piece, but I didn't read that section. When I first started living in France, I could sometimes be mistaken for being Arab, for example, and I'd go in a kebab shop and someone would start speaking to me in Arabic, and I'd say, I don't speak Arabic, and he'd say, why didn't your parents teach you to speak your language? I said, I don't understand. I'm American, yes, but what are your origins? I'm black American. No, you're not black. Michael Jordan is black. So at first it was a very discomforting experience to not be read the only way I've ever thought of myself. now I'm kind of, after living in France for a long time, I'm kind of used to not having people necessarily assume on meeting me that I am what I think I am. And then at some point I just got to kind of like it too, because I just, in France, can kind of, outside of my professional work, I can step outside of this kind of constant awareness of race. And I'm not exactly sure what, I haven't had somebody speak Arabic to me in years now, so I don't know if I stopped looking Arabic to them now. I need to get back in the sun. I don't know, but yeah, it was disorienting at first, and then it became something that I just think of as kind of the natural state of things. And then when I go back home to the United States now, people say you're like a Euro or something. Like they think I'm not. They no longer read me as American the way I think either, because you develop funny ways of talking or saying things. My command of the English language is falling. So.